I'm going to give a quick overview of the Dice bot, which is a really simple off-chain bot built in Rust. Users can send commands to it to toss coins or roll dice. Here we go. So you can follow along with the code. This code, there'll be a link in the description. So let's look at the entry point to this bot. So the main function. First thing we do is we load the config. I'm not going to dig into that here. You can handle the config however you want in your own bot. You could copy this one if you like. Because this is an off-chain bot, we need to give it a PEM file, and this PEM file is what will be used for signing. It holds the identity that will be used for signing requests to the IC. If you're building a canister bot, you don't need a PEM file. The canister can already sign requests. So you use that PEM file to build your agent, and all of your requests will go through the agent. And then the next thing you need to do is build this OpenChat client factory instance. So what this is every time your bot receives a command, the SDK will give your command handler an OpenChat client instance. We'll dig into that in a sec. So then once you've got your OpenChat client factory, you then pass that into what we've called the command handler registry. So we've tried to move as much of the heavy lifting as we can into the SDK. So this command handler registry, as each command comes in, you register during the initialization, you register your command handlers, and then as your bot receives each command, the command handler registry will validate the request, then forward the request on to your command handler. So it makes it nice and simple to implement your bot. Okay, so command handler registry, you see we're calling register twice. That's because our bot has two commands. It has a coin command, which can toss coins, or a roll command, which can roll any number of dice. So when you call register, you have to pass in an implementation of this command handler trait. Let's come back to that. Then we've got this state that we want to pass into the command handler anytime a command is received. And then in this instance, I'm using Axum, the Axum web server. You can use any web server you like, or if you're building a canister, then you just need to listen for requests on the HTTP request endpoint. So whenever OpenChat sends a command to a bot, it does it on the /execute command path. So I'm using Axum here, so I'm setting up the Axum router. I say on the root /execute command, handle the request using this command handler, which you can see down below. We'll get to that in a sec. And then we've got this layer, this middleware that extracts the JWT. So anytime a user will say like /roll, hit enter, the OpenChat front end will call into one of our the backend canisters and get a JWT, and that JWT contains all of the command details and then a signature. And that signature just can be used to verify that any request comes from OpenChat. So you need the JWT in order to then process the command. So you don't have to use this layer, but it just makes it nice and simple, because you see in the command handler now we just have the JWT readily available and the shared state. If we didn't use this layer, you can still get the JWT, you just need to pluck it out of the request headers. Okay, and then also I've defined a fallback. So if you hit /execute command, it will go into this command handler. Any other path, it will just return the bot definition. So you know the description and then each of the command definitions. So let's dig into what happens when the bot receives a command. So it will fall into this function, this command handler. And then what happens is we call execute with the JWT and the public key, which is needed to verify the signatures, and the time now to check that the JWT hasn't expired. So this is the command handler registry. So you don't really need to know what's happening internally, but let's take a look anyway. So this is within the SDK, so you don't need to build this in your own bot. So what happens in the command handler is we parse the JWT, we validate it against the OpenChat public key, and we check it hasn't expired. If it has, then we return a bad request, either access token invalid or access token expired. So if the JWT is valid, then we pull out the command name. Let's not worry about this sync API key is like an inbuilt special command, but we can skip over that for this demo. Then we get to here, and based on the command name, we look up the relevant command handler, and that is based on the handlers that we've registered here. So if we just dig into one of them, when you register a command handler, you need to implement the definition of the command and then execute. So in this bot, I've made it so that the definition is held within a lazy lock. So it only actually builds this definition object once, which is like down here. You can see it has the name, the description, the parameters. It only builds that once, and then anytime definition is called, it just returns a reference to that existing object. And then here's the execute implementation, which we will come to in a second. So we get the relevant command handler, and then it validates that the args are correct. So, if your command says it needs like a string argument and then an integer argument, this command handler will validate that the command that the user submitted has those correct arguments. So you don't need to do the validation yourself. And then once the validation is complete, we just do command handler execute, and then that takes us to the code that we were looking at a second ago. Let's look at it for role. So in here, this is what you would need to implement for each of your commands. You need to implement definition and execute. So the execute function, it gets past an OpenChat client instance. This instance will contain the bot command context, and that has all of the things like the bot ID, the canister that you need to post requests to, we call it the API gateway, the command details, so like the command name, who initiated the command, the arguments that they passed in. So for our command, this is the role command. There are two arguments, the number of sides and the count. Essentially, this is how many sides each dice should have, and then the count of how many dice to roll. Both of these arguments are optional. So you see I'm using maybe arg because it just returns an option, because the user doesn't have to provide any of them. So if the arg doesn't exist, we just default to 6, and for the count we default to 1. And then given that we now have the number of sides and the count, we can then build a really simple message where it just generates a random value up to the number of sides, and then it just does that for each count. So, if you say number of sides 10 and count 5, then 5 times it will generate a random number between 1 and 10 and output each one on a new line. And then, so we've got our message, and then we say send text message, and this returns like you can use the builder pattern, so you can do things like you can say like with block level markdown, if you wanted to use markdown. These other things aren't really relevant in this case, so let's not worry about those. But there are other options there if you want to do more complex messages. Then in order to send the message to the OpenChat backend, we call execute, but then we also want to return the message here so that we have the message available so that we can return it to the caller. So there's two things you can do here. You can either say execute async, which you then need to wait on, and that would wait for OpenChat to go through consensus, but we don't really want to do, and normally you wouldn't want to do that because you want to return to the caller as quickly as you can, just to have a nice UX. So we just do a fire and forget, execute, then return message. So we've got the message here, and if you want to do some continuation, these are the args and the result. You could say if the result is an error, then log an error. If it's successful, increment some counter, or so on. But in this simple example, we just throw away the response. And then we return with the message. And what that does is, in this execute command handler, by returning the message, we then finish by saying return the status of OK and return the message as bytes to the caller. So what that means is that the user will say /role, they can input their arguments, hit enter, and the bot will generate the random values. It will submit that to OpenChat, which will then start going through consensus. But while that's happening, it will return to the caller. So the caller can see after 100 milliseconds their message without having to wait for it to go through consensus. Yeah, so that is it. That's how you can build a really simple command bot. So now let's switch over to OpenChat where we can see what that all looks like from a user perspective. Okay, so now I've switched over to OpenChat. So I've just got a local copy of OpenChat running, which for instructions on how to do that, just take a look in the OpenChat repository. In the README, it shows you how to get it set up locally. And I've just registered a user and I've created a bot, a group called DiceBot Test, just for this testing the DiceBot. So I first need to register the bot. So we've got an inbuilt command called register bot. So the bot name is DiceBot, and then the bot principal is, okay. So when I created the bot PEM file, I did it by creating a DFX identity. And so to get the principal, I just use DFX again. And I'll just use the DiceBot identity and then use the identity command get principal. So that is the principal. And then the URL is, take a look in the config, port 12345, very nice. Oh yeah, the bot isn't running. Okay, let's try that again. Okay, so yeah, by putting in the bot endpoint and then hitting this refresh button, it will send a request to get the bot definition. And because of how we wired it up here, that request will have been handled by this bot definition handler, which is here, which just returns the full bot definition, including the definition of each of the commands. So that allows us to see the commands here. So let's register that. Okay, so the bot is now registered with OpenChat. Next, we need to install it into this group. So you can click Add Bots. Here's our bot, and then Install. I've done one thing wrong. I need to, because this is a new instance of OpenChat running, I need to pass in the OpenChat public key. So if you go to Profile and then Bot Client Config, then OpenChat public key, copy that, and then drop that into your config. So in fact, let's stop the bot running. And then we just put this. Okay, let's run that again. And so now there should be roll, and we can say, let's say like 100 sides and roll 5. And what that means is each dice will have 100 sides and we roll 5 of them. And so you see I got the response almost immediately, much quicker than a round of consensus. And that's because in the command handler, I'm returning the response without waiting for the action, without waiting for the message to have been sent to OpenChat and had a response there. And so that's just quite nice from a UX perspective, to make it seem really responsive. Yeah, I think that's all I wanted to cover in this video. So yeah, go build some cool bots.